Hello, everybody. My name is Noar. I'm a pediatrician and infectious disease specialist and epidemiologist and a few other things. But my area of work is around vaccine deployment and vaccine evaluation. And I've been doing that for a pretty long time in different places around the world. And obviously in the last year or so, pretty much all of my work has shifted. Well, not all, but most of my work has shifted to work on coronavirus vaccines, evaluating the trials that have been published or prior to them getting published, reviewing deployment strategies, advising countries on appropriate decisions and preparedness and all that kind of thing. I also do some work for the World Health Organization, providing scientific oversight for both policy documents and peer-reviewed papers and so on coming out of there. I hold a faculty position at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and I'm Deputy Director of the International Vaccine Access Center there. We work mainly on making vaccines available to countries that otherwise would have difficulty affording it or so on. So that's what I do. So there's obviously a huge amount that we could cover, but I'd rather be, I guess, directed by your questions, and maybe they could come up through the chat if you want. But I'll address my remarks very quickly, perhaps, just to say the following, a few comments. I hesitate to use the word unprecedented because it's been used an unprecedented number of times in the last few months. But, you know, we are in an unusual situation where we've had a pandemic that occurs, roughly in the order of 1 in 100 years or less. Thankfully, not an extremely terrible one. I know it has been terrible, and perhaps the response to let me just plug in 1 second. Perhaps in part, not just the virus, but the response to the virus has at times perhaps been not perfectly balanced or thoughtful, and there'd be different views on that, and they're all very valid views. But certainly in terms of the pandemic itself, a highly infectious pandemic, thankfully not an extremely deadly pandemic, certainly not compared to previous coronavirus large-scale international epidemics like the MERS coronavirus epidemic, which occurred in 2012, case fatality, which would have been, probably initially skewed upwards, but nevertheless, was a case fatality of about 35%. We're very, very fortunate that we don't have a coronavirus like that with the infectivity that we have currently and that kind of mortality. That would be a tremendous event if that was to happen, akin to the Black Plague in Europe and stuff in the 1300s. So we're nowhere like that. Nevertheless, we have a highly agent that has done a very efficient job, thank you very much, infecting the entire globe pretty quickly, and is taking a toll in older adults, is taking a toll in persons that have other medical conditions, including obesity, which is very common, and indeed also taking, although in relative terms, a much lesser toll, but still is occurring because of the magnitude of the outbreak, is also taking its toll in younger adults. And obviously the saving grace of this whole thing is that children are relatively spared, notwithstanding the issues of the systemic inflammatory response thing that we have heard about. That's extremely rare. So this is a major global pandemic. Within a short span of time, relatively speaking, we've been able to produce an array of different vaccines to help mitigate the effect of this pandemic in short order, really, much quicker than has been the case in the past. So I might address my comments briefly about how that happened, how we were able to get to where we are quickly, and what does that mean. The normal process of developing a vaccine is that companies put in an effort on the assumption that they will have a product at the end that they can sell. That's just the reality of things. They have to invest money to make, to run trials, to do all the preclinical studies, the animal studies, the bench studies, and then eventually the human studies. All of that takes time and effort. Then once they have a product that they think has clinical efficacy, that means that it reduces some kind of outcome in humans that is of relevance clinically, for example, a disease, then they would go to the FDA or other body around the world and they would seek licensure. If their data are not good enough, or if the trial design wasn't well thought through, or things like that, they can be sent packing back to the drawing board. Obviously, in the context of the pandemic, we can't afford to have everybody go back to the drawing board. So the FDA and other licensing authorities around the world got together in that regard, really, exemplary way, sharing protocols, sharing data, sharing available evidence, and said, do the trials this way. We're going to have a combined data safety monitoring board across all trials. Pfizer wasn't part of that, but for the other trials. That way, if we have rare events emerging in this trial and a rare event emerging in that trial, we'll see it all at the same time, so it'll emerge more quickly, and conduct the trials in that way. So that's what was done, and huge investment was put into it, literally billions of dollars into these companies, so that the trials that they conducted were very large, much larger than they would otherwise normally be for any therapeutic that goes onto the market and achieves licensure. Usually that's much smaller trials. These were very large trials, and sadly, because COVID is such a common disease, it was very easy and quick to accrue cases of COVID. And so when you're randomizing people, volunteers, into a placebo arm and into a vaccine arm, it doesn't take very long before you start to see the accrual of cases in the two arms. And obviously the assumption is that if the vaccine is working, then you would see the accrual of cases occurring less quickly in the vaccinated arm and more quickly in the placebo arm. And that's in fact how you determine efficacy in a trial. So all of that happened. In addition, we've been following up the safety outcomes in those trials. And we know quite a lot now about the fact that these are very unpleasant vaccines compared to the usual types of vaccines that are given. These are vaccines, they're both the mRNA vaccines and also the adenovirus vector vaccine, which is the AstraZeneca one, not yet available in the US, may not be, much more reactogenic. They cause much more local side effects and systemic side effects for that matter. That they're mild to moderate, and if you've got fever for 2-3 days and muscle aches and a crampy arm, that's not so pleasant, and it's more than not pleasant. But they wane, they go away, those symptoms, after about 2-3 days. The key issue, there are two key issues that are still unknown, and I can see lots of questions coming, so I'll take a look at them in a second. There are two key issues that remain relatively still unknown. The first are, well, three, let's call them three different issues. The first is the longevity of the effect. How long will protection last from these vaccines? We don't know because we haven't had enough time, but the trials are supposed to be continuing out to about 2 years. There are ethical challenges in continuing a trial when you have a licensed vaccine, and if I'm in a placebo arm, how am I going to be continued on placebo when there's a vaccine available? So there are challenges in that and ways around those issues, but nevertheless, the trials are supposed to be following out for 2 years, and we will see whether or not protection wanes over time. The second is in terms of safety outcomes. We know a lot about the short-term safety outcomes up to about 5 months, but we clearly want to know things for a longer duration than that. It should be said that whatever things we will be observing from now on are likely to be relatively rare outcomes. And when you're weighing up the safety of the vaccine, you have to weigh, the risk of the vaccine, I should say. You need to weigh that up against the risk of not being vaccinated also. There are two risks in any uncertain decision, the risk of action and the risk of non-action. And so long as COVID disease is prevalent and spreading quickly and likely to cause severe outcomes in certain groups, then those risk-benefit balance has to be weighed up rationally on both sides. So safety is an issue, but rare events will occur, and rare events that will be serious will occur, and maybe even deaths will occur, and in fact probably have occurred, but they have to be taken in context of the risk from COVID, and they also have to be taken in the context of the background rate of those events. So let's just give you an example. If I take the normal death rate for elderly adults in the UK, for example, 0.03%, for example, in any 2-week period, if I vaccinate 1 million people, even if I just click my fingers and I see how many people die after that, out of 1 million people, maybe 30,000 deaths will occur in the next 2 weeks. So if I give everybody a vaccine and there's 30,000 deaths occur within 2 weeks of receiving a vaccine, it's really important we understand to be able, but that we're able to differentiate what's causal, what are the deaths, excessive deaths that are caused by the vaccine, and what are deaths that would have occurred had there not been the vaccine there. That requires very diligent, very careful, very studious, and very honest epidemiology. So that will be required, particularly because the vaccine has been given to vulnerable groups. Okay, so I spoke about the longevity of the effect. I spoke about adverse events. And the third thing that I said that we don't really know very much about, that third thing is really whether the vaccine will induce protection, not against the disease, but against the infection. So by that I mean that you can be infected with the organism and potentially not have any symptoms from that. Okay, and we know that that's actually a relatively common feature with coronavirus, with the SARS-2 coronavirus, that people can have asymptomatic infection, but they can still be transmitting. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because if I give a vaccine that reduces disease but doesn't reduce transmission, and everybody thinks, well, whoopee, I've been vaccinated, I can now take off my mask and I can go back and congregate, then transmission paradoxically will go up. Well, paradoxically, it'll go up. And if not all groups that are vulnerable or high risk have received the vaccine or are accepting of the vaccine, or they're worried about the vaccine, or whatever it is, or that it doesn't work as well in the elderly, for example, which at least thankfully we know the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines do seem to work well in the elderly. But had they not, or if there are groups that don't receive the vaccine and our risk and transmission is increasing, then paradoxically you could see an increase in deaths and so on. So it's really important to know whether the vaccine reduces transmission or not, because this whole concept of herd protection and the reduction of the incidence of disease will only occur if the vaccine reduces transmission. It will not occur if the vaccine reduces disease. And if a vaccine reduces disease, it'll be extra important to make sure that everybody who's at risk gets it first before we start giving it to other groups for the sake of transmission reduction. There wouldn't be as much point in doing that if the vaccine doesn't do that. So from the animal models that we know, the animal studies, we know that there is some reduction in transmission, but we haven't yet seen the human data on that for the mRNA vaccines. The AstraZeneca vaccine, which is an adenovirus vector vaccine, we do have some information, and it's relatively disappointing. It doesn't seem to have done a great deal for transmission. There's a whole body of work going into this and looking at this, a commission through WHO and CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations. They're the ones that pushed for or encouraged the development of all of these vaccines. So there's a lot of work going into that, but at the moment it remains uncertain. And that's okay, because this is science in real time. We're seeing all of this evolving. Scientists don't know anything in advance. We don't claim to. And we're learning like everybody's learning, but we're just doing it very methodically and hoping to get to the important answers as quickly as possible. And so that's where we are. That's it really. So what we do know about the vaccine, is that it's much more effective than we had hoped, or efficacious than we had hoped at reducing disease. And so it will be really important to be taken by groups who are at risk, and probably groups who don't perceive themselves to be at risk, but they still are at greater risk of COVID than they are from vaccine harm. I'll stop there, and then maybe I'll look at some of the questions.
Yeah, if maybe I can kind of help moderate that for you, and
Sure.
try to get some themes. So again, obviously you've just addressed this, but maybe directly. So what's your 60-second message out there to a healthy 55-year-old who is nervous about this and would rather wait 6 months? What's the argument, or what's the argument? What's the message?
Yeah, I mean, people should go and be vaccinated. Clearly, the reason is that the COVID is still very prevalent. We're at worst levels of COVID than we've been. And it's causing fatality, and it's causing morbidity, and it's causing it in people who are above 55, 65, and so on. As you go down in age, obviously the relative fatality is in relative terms less, but it's still a major absolute cause of issues because it's so prevalent. We are confident in the safety of these vaccines that are available, and we don't know everything, but we never know everything. But when you're balancing the two risks, the risks of COVID versus the risks of the vaccine, the decision is relatively straightforward. It's clear. Obviously, that decision or that balance of risk differs for different groups. If I'm 85 or 75, There's zero query question at all. Like, it's clear that the benefit of the vaccine outweighs the harm potentially. But in younger groups, it's a valid question because you always have to weigh up risks and benefits, and they differ in different populations. But the message is that even in younger age groups, the benefit is still in favor of vaccination, and people should go out and be vaccinated. And it's not going to be easy to get a vaccine for a while yet, but we should avail ourselves of it if it becomes available.
Anybody who should have questions, pregnant women or again, I don't know if you want to paskin, so to speak, but any situations where you would say, you know what, you should speak to somebody before you do it.
So whenever you have a personal query about your personal situation, then of course you should speak to your physician. I'm speaking in general terms, in public health terms, in policy terms, and so on. But the following information about pregnancy: pregnant women were excluded from the clinical trials. That's normal because those clinical trials were not only looking at efficacy, they were looking at safety. They were designed to pick up safety signals. And so it's normal that we take risks with volunteers. People volunteer, they're aware that they're taking a risk, and they're potentially also being protected. But we don't include pregnant women in the regional run of trials in most cases. There's some exceptions. And we do that because we want to first of all establish safety. Once we've established safety in healthy, non-pregnant, even though pregnancy is normal, non-pregnant individuals, then we say, okay, well, we're taking a risk now also with pregnant women and their unborn children. And in fact, that's happening now. So Pfizer is now recruiting. Moderna is yet to do that, I think, but Pfizer is now recruiting in pregnancy. And we feel confident now to do that because of the safety data that we have so far. And we'll see. We also have good safety data from animal studies. There were pregnant animals, specifically recruited pregnant animals, volunteer animals. And they were, and nothing happened. There was no risk to that. Now, COVID itself is not as bad as influenza on pregnancy, for example, but it does cause an increased risk to pregnant women compared to non-pregnant women, and also to the pregnancy itself. And so the question is, what should we do at the moment? And the balancing of risks and benefits at the moment is likely to be in favor of vaccinating pregnant women. And so pregnant women are told, if you're in a group that is eligible to receive the vaccine, you can go ahead and receive the vaccine, but certainly feel free to ask specific questions. There are many individual circumstances that public pronouncements don't necessarily fit. And in all such cases, you should definitely get personal advice.
Got it. Oh, thank you. There was an article in the Times this morning, and this is probably the question that you get asked most, and is being batted around. So you've been vaccinated. Let's say you're after your second dose, 14 days after your second dose, and then as you just said, they're saying, okay, you could possibly still transmit the virus. I think the point of the Times article that I understood was kind of like, okay, obviously that's something that's still being studied. But the chances of that are X, and I don't certainly want to put numbers in there. So is this a question of time? In other words, okay, right now we can't tell you to do more than, to change much of your behavior because you might transmit the virus, but hopefully with time we will find out that's not really the case. How about if both parties are vaccinated? Would that change the way you can behave? Like, I think, for some people, I think that they're feeling like, okay, we're getting this vaccination, then we're saying nothing changes, and that, again, you're not a psychologist, but this is, it's a little bit of a downer. It's kind of like, okay, so what has this done for us, so to speak? So if you can address that a little bit in terms of where you think we would be 2 weeks after the vaccine, or maybe 3 months from now, 2 weeks after the vaccine, with more information.
Well, I can answer that at two levels. At the individual level, it's likely that there will be some protection against infection and transmission, but at this stage, it looks likely that degree of protection will be less than the protection against disease. Okay, so if the vaccines in the trials were 95% efficacious against symptomatic COVID, it doesn't mean that they won't be efficacious against asymptomatic infection, but they could be less efficacious against asymptomatic infection. Now, how less, we don't know. Is it 75%? That's still pretty good, odds. Is it 50%? Is it 6%? We don't yet know that information. So in the interim, like was before, yes, we should continue to consider ourselves potentially infectious to others and balance those against, the people with whom we have contact. If we're going to visit Baba and Zayda and Baba's recovering from breast cancer chemotherapy or whatever, then we need to be extra careful and not just take it easy because we've been vaccinated. But if we're visiting people who are at low risk in and of themselves, then perhaps that calculation can be different. the vaccine will contribute to our emergence from this pandemic. But on its own at this stage, it's insufficient. That's at the individual level. At a population level, there will be a major difference. The key purpose of vaccinating the population is not so that we don't have masks. It's not so that we can go back to class. It's so that we don't have deaths. And so if we can get the vaccine out there to enough people who are vulnerable and to sufficiently vaccinate the elderly and people with comorbidities and communities of color and other groups that have been at high risk of fatality, then we will see a major reduction in deaths and hopefully a major reduction in hospitalizations. Once we see that, even if we're still all wearing our masks, we can take a big sigh of relief into our mask, and then we can reevaluate where we're at. But I think first of all, we have to see a reduction in mortality and morbidity. Once we can see a mortality and morbidity reduction, then even if we can, by reducing masks, we increase the risk of transmission, well, at least we know that we have the capacity to cope with that, and at least we know that we've achieved a major issue here, which is the reduction in mortality and morbidity. There will still be this residual question, but then at what point is it appropriate to stop with all of these other things? And we're not there yet, but we will be. And the way we're going to get there is with vaccination and maybe with second generation vaccines. In other words, maybe we're going to continue to have to work on vaccines that reduce infection as well as disease, but I wouldn't wait for those vaccines before we roll out these ones, because the whole point is to reduce the death rate. That's why we're doing what we're doing. So the fact that, for us it's still a frustration or annoyance, or we can't have people over for Shabbos lunch, and I'm not minimizing the huge impact that this has had, but the key issue is to reduce deaths. Once we can do that, then perhaps we can reopen the economy even with masks. That's the critical issue: services and availability of normal economic activity, which has hit families and children and everybody so hard, and itself has a toll on morbidity, mortality, and suicide rates, and domestic violence, and many other harms that come to humanity from the response to the vaccine. And getting that balance right has been so difficult. Maybe that can be eased even while we're still wearing masks. And once we emerge slowly from all of those things, then we can finally say, okay, life is a bit more normal.
Mm-hmm. And a direct question. So I'm vaccinated and my parents are vaccinated. Can we see each other with no restrictions, some restrictions, all restrictions?
The current recommendation officially is that it doesn't matter if you're vaccinated or not, you need to continue with wearing masks and social distancing. The reality of individual decision-making, how much you're willing to be makel on those things, how lenient you're willing to be on those things, depends on your personal circumstances. If your mother is an elderly lady, you need to be more careful. If, on the other hand, your mother really needs help in the house and you're the only one that can give it to her, then, you've got to weigh up the individual realities of people. But the general principle behind the thinking, the starting point is, for now, things are continuing unchanged in terms of masks and distancing.
And even if both parties are. Got it. Okay.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Children, tell me where we are now with children and where you think we'll be, 16, sure. 18, 14.
Just one other small point about that previous question. 95% efficacious is very high, but it still means 1 in 20 can get sick.
Yep.
Okay. So just remembering that. And so it's a question of who are you talking about? Somebody who otherwise probably will get mild illness, okay, fine. But if somebody's at high risk, you have to weigh that up. Children, we don't know anything yet about vaccine in children. The Pfizer vaccine was evaluated in people down to the age of 16. One of the Indian killed vaccines an inactivated vaccine was evaluated in children down to the age of 12. Currently, Moderna and Pfizer are recruiting children down to the age of 12. Once they do that, they'll be recruiting presumably children down to the age of 5. Whether they'll recruit children below that age is not yet known. The key issue there is really about safety, and we're going to be looking at safety outcomes in those children. Again, that's a normal sequence of events that we first look at healthy adults, and only then we look at children, and there are ethical reasons for that and other reasons for that. Once we know that, then presumably there will be emergency use authorization will be broadened to include those groups if it's safe. But they're not a priority group. They're not a priority group because they themselves are at low risk of severe disease. They may be prioritized if we knew that the vaccines reduce transmission, and there would be a reason to argue perhaps to vaccinate children for the sake of transmission reduction, but older children, not so much younger children. But the reality is at the moment that neither are younger children very major transmitters, nor do the vaccines necessarily, nor are they known to definitely reduce transmission. So all of that deprioritizes children. In a congregate setting like a school, the focus should be on vaccinating teachers and protecting the teachers themselves, and the whole pod system and all the bubble system and all that, well, unfortunately needs to continue for a while as transmission reduction. We can't rely on the vaccine for that just yet, but we certainly should be giving to teachers. And I read the New York current phase, I think, from January 11th, did include teachers. So they're not going to be easy to get, but officially they're eligible. So they
now here we have about 180 people on this call, and I think 140 of them have received their first dose. So they got it early, and that's where this group is right now. Oh shoot, I can't remember what I was about to ask you. Do you think it's worthwhile with the vaccine show? Oh, sorry. So let me go back. I don't know how much you deal with supply and distribution. We've been hearing this on different sides, but are you hopeful that that's going to get better? Is distribution problem, supply problem? The city says it's a supply problem. They blame it on the state. The state blames it on the federal government. But tell me where you think we are from your perspective.
Yeah, sure. So you're breaking up a bit with the audio. So I think the question is relating to supply and procurement. I mean, this was a foreseeable issue. I mean, I published about this, I don't know, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, whenever it was, to say we have to plan for it because it's going to be an issue. Again, this is another one of the areas that is unprecedented in scale and magnitude. And normally we produce 300 million doses a year of vaccine for the world's birth cohort, and now you're talking, in the billions. So this is no factory, no single company, nobody can do that. Now, having said that, the part of the Operation Warp Speed funding went into scale-up manufacturing, and manufacturing is being scaled up. Pfizer is announcing that they're changing the nature of their manufacturing procedures in order to increase volume. Many other companies are doing the same. There will be companies in other parts of the world also that have the capacity to scale up manufacture. Once you scale up manufacture, then you also need to obviously have the infrastructure for delivery, and it has to be delivered under a very ultra cold chain and all of that stuff. And then you have to make available points for distribution, who's going to be distributing, who's going to be vaccinating, how are you going to do it in a way that's safe and doesn't cause people to congregate, how do you reach the elderly, and so on. We had now an opportunity with the flu vaccine this winter now to try different mechanisms for reaching older adults with flu vaccine as a kind of a dress rehearsal really for a COVID vaccine, and there are lessons learned from that in many jurisdictions. And so big efforts are going to be made to make that happen. But, Israel is a small country. Israel has Kupot Cholim, HMOs. Israel, everybody is registered and their medical record is electronic. Israel is geographically small. Israel is very good at logistics and militarizing logistics and stuff, so they did very well. But they were always going to do well. It's kind of not a surprise that they did well. The United States is a big giant of a country, with each state is a country unto itself, and with huge complex health system, and peripheralized responsibility for a lot of that stuff at the moment. So it's a challenge, and it will continue to be a challenge for some months, but we'll get over it, and we'll eventually get there, but it'll take a long time, and as it will in other countries.
Right. Some people on this call are worried about not getting their second appointments being canceled. Hopefully that won't happen, but what would you say to people in terms of how they should approach that in their heads? How nervous they should be?
I think it's likely that, I think whether or not there's this idea being floated around of delaying the second dose, giving everybody, as many people as possible, the first dose, and then going to the second dose. That's being discussed at the policy level. The FDA has come out cautiously against that. The United Kingdom is taking that approach because the data from AstraZeneca vaccine is a little bit more in favor of doing that. There are not really much data from the Pfizer vaccine on doing that. In principle, it makes some sense to delay the second dose, because the longer you delay before you give your second dose, usually the more robust the response will be to that vaccine. For the reason for that is biological, because the cells of the immune system mature over time, and so if you give them time to mature, then they will be more likely to have a vigorous response on the next exposure. You have to balance that against wanting to achieve immunity as quickly as possible in the context of a pandemic. So initially, there were some of these clinical trials, they tried doing some regimens as quickly as 2 weeks, or even less, and other regimens 28 days and so on. The aim being that we would rather get rapid immunity and deal with the longevity issue later than give really robust immunity, but have to wait till everybody gets a second dose. So it really depends on context, it depends on the vaccine, it depends on where the evidence is. The bottom line, I guess, is what I'm saying is that since we need to continue masks and distancing, even if you got your second dose, you certainly should do that if you got your first dose. And don't worry too much if it takes you, 2 months before you got your second dose. It's still going to be effective. It might even be more effective. But clearly, we want you to be protected as soon as possible, and it's a question of logistics of making that happen. After your first dose, from about 12 days after your first dose, you're probably protected at about 50% efficacy. And after the second dose, immediately you're about 91% efficacy. And about a week or 10 days after your second dose, that's when you reach 95% efficacy. Not the people here, but the people in the trial. That was what was seen. In the real world, the effectiveness is likely to be slightly lower than that. But still, one dose is protective to some degree. It halves the risk. That's already something. And that was the level at which licensure emergency use authorization would have been granted had the vaccines not performed as well as they did. We're kind of spoiled by the fact that we got a 95% efficacious vaccine straight off the bat. That's very lucky. We could have easily had a vaccine that was 60 or 70% efficacious. And if you look at seasonal influenza vaccines, sometimes it's 80%, 70% effective. Other seasons, it's 40% effective because of the match between circulating flu and the vaccine, which is relative guesswork, really. So, we're used to having vaccines that don't work quite as well as this. We're lucky we have a vaccine that works well. A single dose is still very good. It's better than none, much better than none. But ideally, 2 doses would be good. So get it as soon as it's available, as long as you've passed your 21 days and for Pfizer or 28 days.
Okay, but at the very least, what we've learned is that if your thing is postponed by a few days or even by a couple of weeks, that's not
it doesn't matter at all.
Be okay. Okay. I am on borrowed time, Dr. Bar-Zeev. I asked you for 15 minutes and you went on 35, so I think I'm going to let you go. But just to say thank you again for everyone in the world that's benefiting from you, and thank you for giving your time to us and to this group of people. We really, really appreciate it. And you just God should bless you with strength and continued great wisdom to make a difference. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bless us all, hopefully. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for teaching my kids. That's much harder. To teach my kids is much harder.
It's a great deal. It's a great partnership. We'll take it anytime.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Thank you so much. Cool too. Hey, everyone. Let's just finish up. Okay. Happy we had that. 1 second. All right, happy we had that. I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but that is really a special person, as you saw, and doing important work. So I'm happy you had the chance to hear that. Maybe we'll figure out a way to be able to share that with the world. I think I got through. Gabi Zev, did you raise your hand on purpose? She's on mute. Gabi says thank you. Okay, we'll take it. Thank you, Gabi. Wow, that was a lot of information to take in. If anybody has specific questions, though, please, we will, through the regular channels, try to get those questions answered. But I hope that that was, at the very least, encouragement to you to keep on doing what you're doing to help your colleagues get the appointments that they should be getting. As we heard, I think we got 150 who have already had the first shot. So let's keep it coming, and we'll work on that too, because that's important. Questions or comments before we go to write our anecdotals? If you're like me, we could use this to procrastinate a little bit and we could keep on talking. Questions? Rebecca, I'm sorry. I didn't do it yet. I'm not done yet. I'm working on my last couple. Questions or comments? I'm looking. All right. Going once.
Rabbi.
Yes, who's that?
I saw Marcy put in the chat and I was wondering the same thing. Is there a place where people should be logging reactions to vaccinations?
Internally for us?
Anywhere. Is there somebody who, since you were collecting information about what your experience was like at the sites where you got them?
That's a great, I think that, you could certainly, if you feel comfortable putting that in the thing that we put out, you could certainly do that. That would be information for us. I would also ask you to certainly tell our nurses so we know about it and we can, we can use that information to help others. Thank you, Shoshana, and thank you for bringing that up.
I put the link for VR Safe, which is the CDC run thing. They're also monitoring reactions and will reach out to you if there's something abnormal.
That's great. We are really trying to to at least understand what's going on with the I think for the most part this is now for seniors. I think that that most of the teachers have been able to get appointments, and I know that some of you are still trying. But hopefully we'll see some improvement with the supply chain, and also just being able to match people who are in need with appointments, etc. So please continue to send that information in. Tal Buskila has this group, COVID, we have a WhatsApp group going that's really, really helping people. So if you need help, please reach out. You have the form that was sent out by email last week. Maybe we'll send it again. And let's just keep it in mind. Tammy's clear. And just to clarify, 2 vaccinated people should not be maskless, not just for their own potential risk, but because if they increase their bubble, they can, yes, correct. In other words, right now, what you just heard again is that you could transmit to others. I think that over time, we will find out with more data, what the information on that is. But right now, that was the recommendation. You also heard that obviously this question of the level of risk, and the level of risk certainly goes down with vaccinated people. But yes, in other words, and that is in terms of school policy. No school policy is changing for vaccinated people. By the way, I didn't ask him this, but including testing. In other words, testing will continue to happen, and when we do testing after the vacation, that will be including for those who have been vaccinated. That's that might be eventually deemed to be overkill, but right now that's the practice that we're following. So we'll take it from there. Dina, what was your question, or was that with Dr. Bar-Zeev? We missed it.
I just wanted to know going forward, and I assume based on what he said that's the case, but someone who's quarantined, someone who's vaccinated and they have a class going forward, because this will probably be applicable in a number of weeks. If you're fully vaccinated and you've waited that 10 to 12 day period, and assuming 75%, let's say, efficacy, will that person have to quarantine fully with their pod? It's a great question. The answer is right now, yes. I imagine that some of that guidance will shift, but right now the answer is going to continue to be yes until otherwise noted. So yes, all of the restrictions, rules, etc. will apply. Quarantines, etc. will apply right now until more stuff gets out there. Usually, it's going to be CDC, local departments of health, and general recommendations. And I think that over time that will definitely shift. Thank you, Deborah. We sent out, or we're sending out, or we sent out just went out pre-registration. So please do. This is a serious thing. These are good problems. You're the cause of the problems because you're very good at what you do. But we're going to have waiting lists in pretty much every grade. So we actually need to know from you and from everybody else what their story is for next year. We're done. 3 nursery, kindergarten, and many grades already on waiting, even grades that you think are not on waiting lists, because we're talking about changing class sizes and things like that. So we'll talk about that more, but please, it takes about 3 minutes. So please, like today, actually, just go on and pre-register. Any questions, you can call Deborah Ice, and we'll work it out for you, but we want you to pre-register. Please take the time to do that. Could you please share the link to the group that's helping people sign up? The link to yes, Yael, if you could put that in. If it doesn't make it here, you can put it in the Slack. The link to the group that's helping people and sign up, even in other states. By the way, again, there's not magic, but there are people who are, there's a lot of Florida information going through that thing yesterday, and people need help. If we can help them, we're going to try to just share the information that we have, or just tell Seth we'll get the info to the right place. That sounds like a good idea. Okay, so we could do that too. All right, guys. I think that's it. All right. Have a great day. We will be in touch. Stay safe. See you tomorrow. Have fun. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ah, there it is, guys, if you want to pick it up.
Thank you.